In December 1907, more than 3,200 American workers went to their jobs and never came home. And that was not even the worst part of the story. The worst part is that in some of these industries, dying on shift was not treated as a tragedy. It was treated as a cost of doing business. This is the real, documented history of the jobs that built this country and quietly buried the people who built it. You think you know what the old days of work looked like. Coal dust, long hours, a strong back, and a tough attitude. But the truth is, stranger and darker than nostalgia lets on. In some of these jobs, companies calculated exactly how much a dead worker cost them, and it was often cheaper to let people die than to make the job safe. By the end of this video, you will understand why America's most dangerous jobs were not dangerous by accident, they were dangerous by design. And it took mass casualties, not compassion, to change that. Everything you are about to hear comes from federal labor records, coroner's reports, trial transcripts, and the archives of the historians who have spent their careers documenting these industries. Let us start underground. At the Fairmont Coal Company's mines in Monongah, West Virginia, work began like any other Friday morning. Then, at 10:28 a.m. on December 6, 1907, an explosion tore through the connected shafts of mines number 6 and number 8 with enough force to collapse a concrete engine house half a mile away. When the smoke cleared, at least 362 men and boys were dead. Some estimates, given how poorly the company kept track of who was even underground that day, put the true number well over 500. Most of the dead were recent immigrants from Italy, Hungary, and Russia. It remains the deadliest mining disaster in American history, but the number that should actually unsettle you isn't 362. It's this. Some of the boys pulled from that mine were as young as 8 years old. That wasn't unusual. It was policy. Coal companies across Pennsylvania and West Virginia employed what were called breaker boys, children, typically between 8 and 12, who sat hunched for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, over conveyor belts of raw coal, picking out slate and rock with their bare hands until their fingertips split and bled from the jagged edges. Foremen walked the rows with sticks to keep the pace up. The air was so thick with coal dust that some boys developed the lung disease we now call black lung before they'd finished growing. Companies didn't hire children out of cruelty exactly. They hired them because small hands worked cheap and worked fast, and because by age 12, those same boys were expected to go underground and do a man's job in a mine that killed men by the thousands every single year. Therefore, an entire generation of American boyhood in coal country wasn't spent in schoolrooms. It was spent in the dark, breathing rock dust, waiting their turn to go below. That alone tells you coal mining ran on child labor and dead bodies. But the reason nobody stopped it for so long is even harder to accept. It wasn't outlawed because someone finally cared. It was phased out, community by community, only after machines got cheap enough to sort coal faster than a child ever could. Compassion didn't end the breaker boy. Automation did. Now picture a very different workplace, not underground, but 9 floors up, in the heart of Manhattan. On the afternoon of March 25, 1911, workers at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, mostly young immigrant women, some as young as 14, were finishing their shift when a fire broke out on the 8th floor, almost certainly from a discarded cigarette or match landing in a bin of fabric scraps. Flames spread through cotton and paper waste in minutes. And here's the fact that should genuinely make your stomach turn. Several of the exit doors on the 9th floor were locked from the outside. Not broken, not jammed, locked by management to stop workers from stealing scraps of fabric or sneaking unauthorized breaks. Firefighters arrived within minutes, but their ladders only reached the 6th floor. The one fire escape collapsed under the weight of workers trying to flee. With nowhere left to go, women began jumping from 9th floor windows onto the pavement below in full view of a horrified crowd. In under 30 minutes, 146 people were dead. It remains the deadliest industrial disaster in New York City history. But here's the part most people never learn, and it's the darkest fact in this entire video. The factory's owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, were indicted on manslaughter charges and acquitted. A civil suit later forced them to pay the families of the dead a settlement of roughly $75 per life lost. Blank was caught locking exit doors again at a different factory just 2 years later and was fined $20. Therefore, the Triangle fire didn't end because the men responsible paid for what they did. It mattered because the survivors, the unions, and the public turned their grief into the modern fire code and workplace safety laws that still protect workers today. The dead paid the price. Strangers they'd never meet paid it forward. If you think that's as dark as workplace conditions got in this era, you haven't been to the killing floor. By the early 1900s, Chicago's union stockyards had turned slaughter into a science. The industry itself called a disassembly line, the direct ancestor of Henry Ford's assembly line, except this one moved carcasses instead of cars, broken down through nearly 80 separate stations by men wielding knives inches from each other's hands, hour after hour, on floors slick with blood and animal waste. Losing part of a finger was so routine it barely interrupted the shift. Author Upton Sinclair spent 7 weeks undercover in these plants in 1904. And what he documented in The Jungle, the injuries, the filth, the disease, was disturbing enough that meat sales collapsed nationwide within months of publication. But Sinclair himself said something that tells you everything about how these industries actually got reformed. He'd aimed for the public's heart and instead hit its stomach. Congress didn't act because thousands of immigrant workers were being maimed for pennies an hour. Congress acted because Americans were afraid of what might be in their sandwich. The Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act both passed in 1906 on the very same day, and neither one contained a single new protection for the workers themselves. So if child labor, locked doors, and blood-slick floors couldn't kill the myth that hard work was noble work, one final job will. Since 1886, Mohawk ironworkers from the Kanawake community near Montreal have framed America's skyline, the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, the George Washington Bridge, and later, the original World Trade Center towers. For over a century, the story told about them was that Mohawk workers possessed some inborn, almost supernatural fearlessness at height, an idea a Dominion Bridge Company official reportedly floated by, comparing them to mountain goats. But the historical record says otherwise, and it's far more impressive than any myth. Mohawk ironworkers themselves have said their skill came from training, trust, and generations of family teaching family, not the absence of fear, but the discipline to work through it. And the cost of that work was brutally real. In 1907, the Quebec Bridge collapsed mid-construction, killing 33 Mohawk ironworkers from Kanawake in a single afternoon, a loss so devastating it reshaped the community for a generation. Therefore, the men who built the most recognizable skyline on Earth weren't fearless daredevils performing for tourists below. They were skilled tradesmen who kept climbing after burying their own, because the work and the wages that came with it was one of the only paths open to them. So here is what actually connects a breaker boy in a Pennsylvania coal chute, a seamstress trapped behind a locked door, a butcher on a Chicago killing floor, and an iron worker 300 feet above Fifth Avenue. Not one of them died because America did not know the danger. They died because for a long time, a body was cheaper to replace than a building was to make safe. Every safety law you have never thought twice about, every fire exit that is not locked, every age you have to be before you can legally work a factory floor exists because people died first and were legislated for second. The next time you walk past a construction site, a meatpacking truck, or a "please use the stairs" sign by a fire door, remember, someone had to die for that sign to exist. That is the real cost stitched into the built world around you, and most of it does not even have a name attached anymore.